Hey, welcome back to the How to Podcast series. I have another co-host on with me today. I love having co-hosts. Stephanie Wilson is on, and she is the co-host of a podcast called What the Gerrymander, and it's a political podcast. They focus on the U.S. political system and some updates for people following along. And what I love is that Stephanie has found her community, found a topic she's passionate about, and using podcasting to get a message out to the world. Stephanie's on today to talk about her podcast journey, working with a co-host. We're going to talk about women in podcasting, monetization, and then kind of go back and forth and just share our own podcasting perspectives and what we're learning in the process of having a podcast. Here's a little clip from the beginning of Stephanie and Heidi's most recent episode, just to give you a little taste of what it sounds like. And we're going to jump into the conversation here with Stephanie Wilson on the How to Podcast series. Buckle up. Here we go.
But there was something about the way that he framed that word for us. Maybe I was in a position to be able to hear it differently. And for some reason, that really clicked for me yesterday.
I'm Stephanie Wilson, and you're listening to What the Gerrymander, our podcast about reclaiming and rebuilding our collective political power in MAGA-captured states. We hope this podcast inspires you to help build power and restore democracy in Red America. MAGA is using the same strategy of voter suppression, gerrymandering, and extreme culture wars across the country.
Hello. Welcome to the podcast, everyone. Welcome to How to Podcast series. We're back. Stephanie's here with me. We're going to be talking about all things podcasting and lots of great stuff happening in the world of podcasting. Stephanie, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you for having me on, and thank you, everybody, for listening. And I can't wait to have a conversation here.
Beautiful. Awesome. It's good to have you here. Welcome to the podcast. And the great thing about having the How to Podcast series, I get to talk to great people as co-hosts. And that's really fun for me. And we get to encourage people to start a podcast. And there's so many people that come to the show and they literally don't know where to start. So from your perspective, I want to get some thoughts around starting a podcast, getting from idea to hitting record. And maybe if we can hear a little bit of your story, it might inspire somebody to hit record on their end. So can you talk a little bit about how you started with your podcast?
Sure. Well, so I started with an idea, and I have co-founded an organization. I live in Massachusetts, but I've sort of adopted Indiana in the United States. I'm a USian, so I've sort of adopted Indiana, and we wanted to put together a way for people to understand how pro-democracy could win again in Indiana, which is one of those states where autocracy is on the rise. So one of the things we thought about doing was putting together a podcast so that we could let our listeners know what the national landscape looked like in the United States for pro-democracy forces and what activists are doing. And so hopefully they would take away some ideas for concrete action and also learn more about the state of play in the United States and in red states in particular. You know, we have the red state, blue state situation, which is the red states are fascists, led by fascists, captured by fascists, that we have started calling MAGA after Donald Trump's Make America Great Again slogan, and the pro-democracy forces that are fighting these reactionaries. So we wanted to let our listeners know about what is going on and what they can do about it. And we also wanted to give them a chance to hear not only me, but my co-host ran for a state legislative seat in Indiana. And so it was an opportunity for her to get a larger audience and a larger platform. So I was talking to my brother who's in PR, and he said, do a podcast. It's no big deal. Just get Riverside. That's all you have to do. Just get Riverside. You press play and that's all you have to do. So So my suggestion is to understand what it is that you want. This is my suggestion for life, for business, for everything. What do you want to achieve? And make sure that you're clear on what you want to achieve before you start anything. But once you're clear on what you want to achieve, the rest falls into place. Who do you want to be your guests? Who do you want to be your co-hosts? Who do you want to be your listeners? And then the rest of it is kind of implementation, so get as little equipment as you can manage to make it sound good. Riverside, an inexpensive mic. I joined a couple of groups on Facebook, and that has helped significantly. And find a community, and then we can talk about what what you can do to edit your own podcast and get it up and running. But it's a lot more steps than I thought it was, but it's doable for just about everybody.
So before you had your own podcast, were you a podcast listener?
Oh, I am a podcast listener. Every time I'm in the car or go for a walk, I'm listening to podcasts, doing the dishes. I listen primarily to political podcasts, although I have some non-political ones here and there. But I pretty much view it to be one of the things that I have to be involved in this politics because I think it's existential. So I have since just after the 2016 election in the United States.
Okay. So from a listener's...
And so I started listening to experts.
From a listener's perspective, what keeps you coming back to a podcast? What about the podcast, like the mechanics of the podcast, beyond the topic? What are some of the things that brings you back as a listener that you find important that you then bring to your podcast and say, I must do these things because as a listener, I really value A, B, C?
Well, I think for me, one of the most important things is giving the listener something to think about that they haven't heard before, or take away as an action, or even just an insight that makes them think about something in a different way. I've had so many times where I've listened to somebody that maybe I've heard before, and all of a sudden the way they frame an issue is just so completely different, but so completely right that it shakes my entire way of looking at things and reshapes it. So as a listener, I like to hear that. I like to hear intelligent conversation. I really don't like listening to people just chat and have the latest thing on their mind, and especially if it's about a TV show or something like that where they really haven't thought it through. So being thoughtful is really important to me, is just hearing somebody be real thoughtful about whatever it is that they are talking about.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. What about the sound of the podcast and stuff like that?
Oh, well, everything that I listen to is pretty professionally done. So, so I took my cue from that in terms of how I do it. I just listened and modeled after that. I'd like it to sound good. But what I think sounds good and what other people think sounds good can be very different. My 15-year-old son listens to things that I think sound atrocious. but he really enjoys it, whereas he thinks the stuff I listen to is really boring. So,
okay,
for me, it's a smooth and a conversational tone, as opposed to reading off a script or having a rant or something like that.
Yeah, from my perspective, I love connecting with the host, right? Like you were talking about, and whether it's how they present their topic or who they are, or I like when a host is really talking to me and not talking to the camera or talking to the microphone, right? Like they acknowledge me. You build a personal relationship with your host, even though you've never met them in person, potentially.
That's right.
And I just love when that translates through the microphone and you do feel like you're in the room with them. And when they take a moment to address you and say, well, here's something just for you, it's like, well, thank you. That was for me, right? But it's for other people, but it feels like they're talking directly to me. And I love to have that in my podcast where we can really focus in on the person that's here with us. And how do we include them in the conversation so that it's not two people talking to each other, but there's that third person here in the room with us? How do we bring them to the table and let them feel like they're part of this conversation? So I always admire a host that can do that because that's fun for me as a listener.
Absolutely. It's not always easy, and it's not as easy as saying, listeners, I hope you're learning blah, blah, blah. It's really a gift. I think some people are obviously better at it than others, and hopefully the people that listen to our various things get a sense that we are really thinking about them as we're talking to each other so that they feel included in the conversation.
Right. And that's how it differs from like radio, for example, where one person is talking to many, right?
Right.
Hey, everyone. Hey, all, everyone out there in the world.
Exactly.
And they're trying to keep your attention because you have so many options to leave. People, when they hit play on a podcast, they're generally there. You're coming back as a listener and they're ready for the next episode. They start at the beginning. They don't start mid-sentence and mid-conversation. They're starting at the beginning every time. And they're listening all the way through, compared to radio where you just kind of you get in the car and you turn it on the radio and the person's like mid-sentence and you're just joining the conversation. You're like, what's going on?
Right.
People are starting at the beginning, which is unique than radio.
Right. Well, when radio was the only option, or at least the only option I knew about, I was dreaming of a situation where I'd be able to pause it and come back to it.
Right? Yeah.
Right? Which is what you can do on a podcast. And I'm sure podcasts had been a thing for a long time by then, but I was a little bit not as quick on the uptake. And that's what I wanted. I wanted to come in at the beginning of the conversation and be able to listen from the same spot when I got back to wherever I was. And I think people who start a story at the beginning, not too early, and finish at an appropriate time, it's really important. Otherwise, there's a podcast I think is super instructive, but the host starts with, so how was your childhood? It's in a political podcast, right? It's about using tools. It's about how people come to activism. And he starts like in high school. And really, you can start about 20 minutes in and it's okay.
Yeah.
You get it all. And I wish people would think more about the experience of what do people really want to be listening to, so that they get a conversation from beginning to end and don't feel that they have to skip or leave early because it's too much.
Is there anything from your perspective that when you hear it on a podcast, you're like, oh, no, please don't do that. And you're like, I'm sorry. I tried, but I can't listen to a podcast because of fill in the blank. Is there anything that you've had an experience like that?
I've had specific podcasts that I generally like that are the topic of the week is not interesting and I'm not willing to go farther, but it's not necessarily something that the podcaster did. It's just a topic or a person that I find not compelling enough to spend my time listening. So I try to make what we do as compelling as possible, but understanding that people have different ideas of what they find to be interesting and might decide they want to turn it off at some point, want to try to get as much. So here's my theory on the world. Nobody reads anything. People don't read.
Yep. Right.
So you gotta say what you're gonna say in as few words as possible. I design websites too. So like this is part of my theory of world domination. They don't read. You're very lucky if they think critically, and you're even more lucky if they put reading and listening and thinking critically all together in one package. So I try to make it interesting, but also make it possible for somebody who doesn't have the attention span to keep listening to get important stuff out of what I have to say whenever they choose to turn it off.
See, now that's amazing to think like that at the beginning stages of your podcast, because you kind of have to grow into that. You kind of record some episodes and you're trying to figure your way through this. But to hear that from your perspective, that's smart. That's one thing I'd be writing down if I was listening. I'm like, oh, I got to try that. I'd be careful with that.
It's not as easy as saying it is a whole lot easier than doing it, even when you're able to edit, because I feel bad editing anybody's, I can edit out their uhs and their ums, but I really feel bad editing, complete sentences, even if it's word salad and they haven't said anything. And I think I could get a lot better at it, but that's my perspective. And then execution is a different matter.
Okay. So I know, looking from a political side, we can jump there for a second with your podcast. Whenever I've interacted with anyone in that kind of space, and we're up here in Canada and you're obviously in the US, when you have a chance to have somebody who is in that political space, they're used to answering, sometimes, general statement, you're used to answering in circles where you don't really get the actual answer, but you get a great monologue that doesn't lead you to the answer to the question you've posed, or you don't feel like your audience is going to be satisfied with what they just heard. And I've heard other people with political podcasts who then come back at it in a new way and ask the same question again and again and again, because we just want the answer. We don't want to hear the talking points. We want to hear the answer. What is the answer? Because my audience is here for the answer.
Right.
Is there any examples of that for you, that you're just like, I want to make sure my audience walks away with this? Do you have that in your mind before you hit record?
I do. And I have a list of questions. And to some degree, I have a list of answers, what, I expect them to more or less say. Our first episode was a person who has written a book that has guided our organization. It's called Laboratories of Autocracy. And he talks about how state legislatures are really where forces of reaction have captured power, and where they implement essentially fascist laws. So that was our guiding light in terms of the situation that we knew that we were approaching. So we had him on for our first episode, but he has done hundreds of podcasts, and he's the kind of guy who monologues. So that first podcast was really a lot more of him telling his talking points, which were really important, but he was so used to doing it, it wasn't a conversation. It was really a monologue. And I think that was a little bit disappointing. But then everyone we've had since is more human. I mean, we've had people who've done a lot of podcasts, but we have generally beyond him found people who want to be having a conversation, who are happy to be there because they have something that they want to tell people about. And so having that conversation as opposed to a monologue has been important to them.
Okay. Yeah.
So yes,
because I would think when somebody in the political space goes on traditional media, they don't know who they're talking to. They're just talking to everyone because they don't know who's going to watch this, right? Pretty much anybody could watch that show. In podcasting, your audience is really there for the topic. So you can speak a little bit more direct to the people listening because they understand, in a sense, based on your podcast, why you're there as a guest, and you can speak to them more directly. Do you kind of get that sense?
Well, I think that on TV or radio in the United States right now, it's pretty clear who's watching or listening to what medium. But it's more, as you say, of them speaking out at a lectern and figuring out, trying to get their message out to whoever's going to listen. And the podcast is more of a conversation between the host and the guest. And it can be a lot warmer. It can make people feel like they actually know the person who is part of the conversation, because I think it's really easy to put yourself in the position of either the guest or the host and really feel like you're a part of this conversation that's going on a specific topic at a specific moment. And in some ways, if you have a podcast that's hosted by really prominent or famous people, it's a little bit of a false sense. But I think that the podcasts who are, where the host and the guests are both kind of regular people, it's much easier to become part of that conversation.
Okay. I love that. Yeah. And yeah, that's the thing. If a person comes to your podcast and they're not your target audience, they generally just don't come back. And that's fine, because that leaves room for all the people who are coming for the content, and those are your fans. You're creating the podcast for them. So that's the one thing when I'm talking to people about starting a podcast, I'm like, okay, who's your podcast for? Can you answer that question? And then B, who is your podcast not for? And people are like, what do you mean? I want to be for everyone. I want everyone to hug and hold roses and smile and sing songs together, holding hands on a mountain. You're like, well, that's pleasant, but you realize there's some people who are just not going to be your target audience. And if you can identify them, at the same time you identify the people it's for, then you won't be chasing all these different things and having guests on that don't feed your audience and getting sponsors that don't feed your audience. And you're like, you got to know who your audience is and who they're not, and learn that off the beginning.
That's true. Even when you're starting off with only a few listeners and are building it more organically, you are pitching it. And I mean, pitch as in a sound, as opposed to, trying to get somebody to believe something, but you're going at the conversation in a way that you're hoping that a certain population or certain type of people or certain people of a certain intellectual persuasion will be listening. And you're not going to hit everyone, and that's fine.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah. Because there's lots of people who really our podcast isn't for. And some, will listen on sufferance, like my mother. And some who are actually interested.
Hi, Mom. Thanks for listening. That's okay. That's great. So, okay, you use something different than I do as far as editing. So I'd love to pick your brain about this, because that gives us new perspective. I'm traditionally old school. I use my software before I was a podcaster. So I use like Audacity, and I use other tools like that because I used to do that for music mixing. So it's kind of my skill set and where I naturally default to. But I'm hearing lots about what you're using. Can you kind of talk about your editing process and the tools that you find work best for you?
Sure. So I really like this Riverside, which we're using now, because it uploads each person's recording straight to their computer, so it doesn't have to go over the internet before it gets recorded. So already you have better quality that way. And so then what I do is I use an editing tool called Descript, Descript, which turns speech into text, and then you edit the text so that you can take out the filler words. You can see a paragraph that maybe doesn't belong there and take it out. You can, if you want to have a little button at the beginning, you can see what the most useful quote is as you're reading through it, and know that you can put a copy of it at like the top of the podcast, so that it's like a cold open. I have like a cold open where I have a quote from the person, and then a little bit of music, and then a welcome. So finding that cold open is something that's useful in Descript. And it also edits in scenes as opposed to on the timeline. There's a timeline at the bottom, but you don't need to like go and edit just from either the sound waves at the bottom or what's going on in the timeline. Although it's not good enough to completely ignore the timeline. So sometimes when you take out a filler word, or the way I speak, it turns out that I have long pauses between my sentences. So I have to go in there and shorten them, so that people aren't waiting forever to hear what I have to say, because sometimes they take a while to get there. So that's pretty easy, and you can stick music in where you want it. I don't edit video that way. I edit my video clips in Riverside. And so then you download it, and they say it does some sound editing, but I don't feel like it does a good job with that. So this is I thought all I had to do was use Riverside because my brother said so, but my brother had a sound engineer. So I downloaded after I've done that editing, and then I found another piece of software called Ophonic, and everything sounds, everybody uses the AU, like Ophonic, Audacity. Now, the Audacity you use, don't know whether it's the same Audacity that I use in connection with, so it's really confusing. So this is called Ophonic, and it basically does sound leveling with AI. And it's very good because I haven't got any clue how to mix sound nicely. But I found that it's better to run it through twice, and you end up paying for the number of minutes that you use, and it's not that expensive. However, one thing to think about is if you're using Descript for the first time, you can export from Riverside to Descript, but what ends up happening is it ends up transcribing twice. I don't know why. And then you end up using twice the number of minutes that you meant to be. So it's much better to download the audio file and then re-upload it into Descript and then transcribe
Interesting.
it.
Glad you pointed that out.
Well, I had to go back to them and say, hey, I messed this up. Can you please give me back some more minutes? So that's what I use. I also sometimes use a video editing software called Camtasia, and they have a piece of software. It's by TechSmith called Audacity that also transcribes the video into words, and you can also edit on the transcript. And then it'll come back and edit both the audio and the video without having to go right into the timeline and figure out exactly where you need to cut it. And so that's actually a higher quality, but it's much more expensive. I got one of my clients to pay for that.
Yes,
so
that works.
I didn't have to. Yeah.
So for a learning curve for somebody brand new, how hard was it to get started in Descript? Was it pretty straightforward, or did it take a little time to figure it out?
It took me a little bit of time to figure it out, this whole scene. I watched all their videos, and I didn't quite get it until I got into it. And so it's a little bit of a learning curve. And then also so I've talked about a lot of different products, but really you need the recording, and then the editing, and then the sound leveling. And then you can't forget having how you're going to host your podcast, whether it's going to be on your own website or whether you're going to pay for a host. That's like the piece that I hadn't even thought about at the beginning, and then realized I needed to think about. And it's a good thing that I actually paid for hosting, because my website at first hosted just fine, and then it pooped out. It stopped working. So I can't really count on it.
That's good. Who do you use for your hosting?
So I use Podbean.
Nice. Okay.
I tried to go on research and say, okay, which was better, Podbean or Buzzsprout or Anchor, which is now just Spotify. And I tried to figure out which was best. And then I don't know, held my nose and jumped in.
Thank you. Just for those that are listening, make a decision. For the most part, it's relatively easy to move if you need to in the future, if it's not meeting your needs, but watch lots of videos. I love watching those YouTube videos where they do this versus this, and you hear somebody give you the good and bad of both, and then you just make a decision. Ask a few people, and then I love having you on to talk about that, because somebody listening is like, Podbean, I'm going to write that down, Podbean, right? That's great, because we get to hear different perspectives, so awesome. I love that.
Right. And I also really like Podbean's analytics. So it gives me some good analytics about how many downloads, on which days, at what time of day, where geographically people are listening to it. So for instance, most of our people are in the United States, most of them are in Indiana, which makes sense, but a good portion are in Massachusetts, where I live. So it must be kind of maybe my friends listening to it, not sure. And then a pretty hefty number from California, which is where my family is. So I don't know how many of them are family or just people who are interested. So it gives you a chance to see where your audience geographically is.
And I guess
I wish it gave you more information about how long people are listening for, but it doesn't do that.
I guess for your podcast too, being focused on your topic, is there other states listening? You're like, oh, I didn't realize I'd have listeners in that state or in that country. Like, that's shocking to me. I'm amazed. Did you get that as well?
Yeah, I think we're in probably at least 10 states, maybe more. Not huge numbers everywhere, but if somebody from Germany listens, maybe we'll have somebody from Canada after this. So I like seeing that, seeing how far it, I publicize. So what I do is I record on Thursday, I drop it on Monday, and then I drop it at like 1 a.m. on Monday. And at the same time, I schedule a post on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, if it works, and the page of our organization. So on both my personal page and the organizational page. And then I go in and I share in Facebook into about 50 different groups. And on Twitter, I try to tag people who'd be interested.
Nice.
Especially the guest who might have a much larger following than I do. So, and then I go on Post and Spoutable, which are the new Twitter alternatives. And so I'm trying to really get the word out. I bet most people don't spend as much time on social media, but it's the hazard of the trade is that we have to stay on social media.
So you've gone from your brother saying all you need is Riverside, you're good, you're fine, just start with Riverside, and now you've gone to all of these things and social media and this and this and this. Oh yeah, one more thing, right?
Right.
I love it.
Right, exactly. And you know what? He has 2 episodes, and then they stopped.
Uh-oh.
So, we're on episode 10.
Hey.
So
look at me now, right?
We're continuing.
Hey bro, look at me now, right?
Right.
I love it.
And look, yeah.
The student is now the teacher. So there you go.
I'm sure he doesn't like to hear that. He's younger.
Okay.
He was behind me in high school and always was, Stephanie's brother as opposed to his own person.
There you go. Well, I love it. Okay. another thing we chatted about before we hit record was women in podcasting. I'm speaking as a white male in his 50s that I want to hear more women coming to the microphone, sharing their thoughts, either guesting or hosting a podcast, and getting their message out there. When I look at my stats, I see I have 7 different podcasts, and some of them are geared towards men, which I'm happy about. One is called Dad Space, and I created just specifically for men, for good men's mental health and be good partners, good fathers. But when I look at my stats, 75% of my audience are women. And I'm just like, that makes me so happy that there's something in the podcast that's directed towards a certain group, but a different group is finding value. And it makes me wonder, do I change my content a little bit? But no, they're coming for a reason. So I need to continue down that path. And the listeners are the listeners. And I find joy in that. But I would just like to hear more women leading podcasts, because there's an inequality there to that in podcasting. What are your thoughts? How do we encourage women listening today to get out there and start their show?
So, in the political space, there are a good number of women who are leading or hosting. So it's probably not even, but really good. There are really good podcasts by really great women. I think in the wider world, those are all professional people who already understand their value and understand that they have something to say. I think women, in the course of being women, often get this imposter syndrome where we start doubting ourselves that we have the expertise, the presence, the voice, something useful to say. And a lot of times I think we can let that stop us from jumping in. And I want to tell all of you out there that I have it too. You know, I'm a white woman in my very, very early 50s, early 50s. But still, I still, get that sense, especially since my co-host is run for office, but, do I have what it takes? Do I sound ridiculous? Do I make stupid comments? I think a lot of us are always second guessing ourselves. And I think that we have to be a little kinder to ourselves and a little bit more compassionate to ourselves to know that it's a learning curve for everybody and that it doesn't have to be perfect before we start, because I think a lot of women have lived a life where you have to feel and seen better than the rest of the people in the space in order to feel remotely qualified. So I think for those of us who really do have something to say, but doubt ourselves and doubt that people would be interested in what we have to say, is take a little bit of a leap of faith, because people are interested and they do care, and there is content out there for everyone. And people look for different things, and what you have to say is likely what somebody wants or needs to hear.
Yeah.
So go for it. Don't let the imposter syndrome win.
Yeah, there's one podcaster that I was working with, and she was just saying, like, again, towards the imposter syndrome, she just like, I don't feel like I have the authority to talk about this subject. Like, and
right.
So, and I was just saying to that person, I said, listen, you're the only person that's lived the life you've lived. You've experienced what you've experienced, and the opinion you have is your opinion, and no one else. Someone else might agree with you, but nobody can replicate you. It's only you. So you coming to the podcast you're going to have unique insight that no one else can copy. Nobody can do your show except for you.
That is absolutely true, but so many of us have been told for so long, especially those of us who are in our very, very, very early 50s, that that we have to be more than prepared, more than authentic, more than experienced, more than what we already are. And we have to find a way to understand within ourselves at a deep level that we are enough the way we are and that we have very valuable things to share, even if we haven't shared them before. I was in a meeting. So I have another business I've started with my husband and another business partner. And we were talking to another woman. So there were 2 men and 2 women on this call. And both women would say at different occasions, I would say, oh, guys, I think Kate was going to say something. Kate, is there something that you had wanted to say? And she would do the same for me. And our business partner said, I noticed that you were doing this. Is this, you're very much thinking about this empathy. And I was like, hold on a second. Women have been doing this for each other.
Yes.
In conference rooms, on telephone calls, on Zoom calls for a very long time. And it's not necessarily something that's innate. It's something that we've learned, and we've learned that we have to be there for each other, because a lot of times in conversation with men, they just keep going. And so you have to find a way to lift each other up. And so by way of that, I'd like to say, if you're thinking about starting a podcast, you're qualified. Mm. It doesn't matter what your qualifications really are, because you're qualified. Exactly what you're saying. Nobody else has your experience. No one else has your outlook. No one else has your particular insights. And so as another woman, I am saying, is there something that you wanted to say? Because I think this is the time to say it.
It's like you're holding space for someone. I love that.
That's exactly what I'm trying to do.
So,
in a very intentional way.
Okay, so let's flip that the opposite way then. What can men begin to stop doing that doesn't create that space? What are some practical things that men can do to make sure that women that want to come into podcasting feel welcome and feel like they can come to the table and do their show and be supported? Because from my perspective, I really love that quote. We hear it talked about lots about how that rising tide lifts all ships. And I just want podcasting space to be a place where everyone can walk through the door and feel like this is home. Like there are people that are genuinely here that care about me, who hold space for me and let me do my thing. And I feel that they're here to support me in my attempts and not judge me, but support me. What can we do as men in podcasting to make that a safe place and hold a space for women to come to podcasting?
I think that you are doing that tremendously well with just this kind of podcast. I think that having people on who are maybe new podcasters, giving them a chance to practice, giving them a chance to really talk about what it is that they do, giving them a sense that what they have to say is valuable is incredibly powerful. I'd say to other podcasters out there, invite more women to be guests on your podcasts. And when they are guests, give them the space to say not only what they're jumping in to say, but what they're holding back from saying. and see if you can draw that out. Because as women, often will hold back a little if we're not entirely sure how it's going to sound or how it's going to be received. But I think you are a phenomenal example, Dave, of somebody who really does hold that space and goes into these spaces where new podcasters are hanging out and offers that emotional and physical and cyber space to people to really be able to express themselves.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The one thing I'm learning from podcasting is I can take the things that I learn when I'm creating a show, and then I can go and have a conversation with my wife, and I can bring that to our home, and I can bring that ability to create space for my wife. So when she comes home from work and she's got this day that she just has to talk about, and she really needs to explain the events and how she dealt with it, instead of jumping in and cutting her off while she's talking and offering solutions and trying to direct the conversation because I feel like I'm helping, but I'm not, because now she can't even complete a complete sentence without Dave jumping in saying, but I would just do it this way. Why didn't you think of this? And you can see her shut down. I'm listening and podcasting. I'm like, Dave, bring this skill set, bring this way of podcasting home with you. So in a sense, bring your work home with you and use that in your relationships to create that exact same space and feeling in your home. And that's one of my big takeaways, is because when I have a conversation with my wife and I just want to help, I feel like I'm contributing, but I'm actually making it worse because I'm not giving her the ability to express everything that she's thought and then let her come to her own conclusion and support her in the process. Right. And that's my big takeaway, is podcasting can actually help you in your personal life be a better listener and be a better person to engage people and not ramble like I'm doing right at the moment. That's what podcasting can teach you. So I enjoy that too.
That I agree with you, but that's not just a gendered thing at all. I'm a fixer, and I also have to, learn to shut up and and listen. And we have to have more conversations like, okay, is this an event? Do you want me to listen, or are you looking for help with solutions? And making that clear, because I struggle with that too. Not my husband jumping in. He also jumps in with solutions, and I sometimes tell him to, put a sock in it, but also I need to put a sock in it sometimes also.
Yeah, because my audio editing skills don't come into play when it's a live conversation in the living room. There's no way to go back and edit. Right? So, yeah, it's real life.
Right, exactly.
So, yeah, I love it.
No edit button in real life. That sounds like an episode name to me.
Right?
Right? An episode title, No Edit Button in Real Life.
There we go. Somebody's going to steal that. We're going to put that out there. Okay. It's a gift. Someone, you can have that. That's great. That's amazing. It's amazing.
I think about that. I guess people who are musicians probably think about album titles all the time or song titles. I'm just having a conversation and thinking about episode titles.
Right. Your whole world becomes framed by this thing that we now live. And what else sticks out to you right now that could help a new listener, a new podcaster, somebody who's going to start their show? Anything else we haven't really chatted about that you're like, I would really like to just make sure people have this message as they're listening to us today?
I would like people to know that those support groups that are out there, whether it's on Facebook or whatever medium you use, are good places, or can be good places. Whether or not the one you specifically are part of is a good place, there are good places. And those sorts of supportive spaces can be really, really helpful. And so don't shy away from it simply because you're new. But jump in there as well. Okay. Because it's helpful, and you also have something.
You get to meet great people. So, and expand your network.
That's right.
Learn from each other. And the one thing too that I'm really understanding in life right now is that your way is not the only way. You can learn from each other. And come to these Facebook groups, come to these meetings, to these podcasts for what you can give, but what you can learn as well. And because as everyone has the opportunity to display the things that they are passionate about and what works for them, I'm not here in my podcast to convert anybody to anything. I'm here to listen, gain wisdom, and expose everyone to each other's podcast. Let's build each other up and strengthen each other. That's really the whole focus of my podcast. And having you on is great because, again, you're going to have a point of view that's uniquely yours. And to hear your voice and have you here is, for me, is exciting. I'm really enjoying having you here. This is fun.
This is a lot of fun for me too. So thank you for inviting me.
Okay, so before we go, let's promote the show. And one thing I always like to ask is when people come to your podcast, you can definitely give us all the information about that. Where do we start? Like, do we start on the most recent episode? Is there a particular episode we should start with? Or do we go right to the beginning and we start from the beginning and go right from the start? Where would people go when they come to your podcast? Please talk about your podcast and tell everybody more. I'd love to hear more.
That is such a good question because I ask myself what they're doing when I look at the analytics. So it's episodic. There's no narrative arc in our podcast. It's called What the Gerrymander. And it's about how MAGA has captured power through essentially fixing the outcome in various states. So we started with somebody who could explain the playing field, but frankly, I think the episode people should start with is we interviewed a gentleman who was a gun industry executive for a couple of decades, and he came on to tell us that the NRA and the gun industry and the people they sell to are waging a war against people like me and us who are fighting for democracy. And while we are thinking about all of the issues as separate policy issues, they're thinking about it as an existential war. And so that's episode 6 or 7. I'm not sure which. That is a really good place to start. And then you can start to add in the different pieces that fill in the different kind of people who are involved in different policy areas, or being a candidate, or being Gen Z, or all of the other things, or being a woman in politics. But starting with Ryan Bussey, who wrote a book called Gunfight, is a really good place to start. So we've only got 7, 8 episodes, and his was the one that dropped a week ago today. So it dropped on March 21st.
Excellent. Okay, good. See, I love having to direct people because, again, they show up at the podcast, they're like, I don't know where to go. What do I do? Where do I start? So, but then people will go back and listen to them all, right?
I think people go back and start at the beginning.
That's what I do.
Right. But it depends. If it's been on for 7 years, I don't go all the way back.
Yeah.
But if it's been on for 7 episodes, yeah. But I think that sometimes we need a little bit more guidance, because those of us who are, when we're booking it, we don't know. First of all, we don't have that option of really putting it in the order that it ought to be, because we book it sort of as in a haphazard sort of way. It'd be kind of cool to go back and tell people what order to listen in. Maybe I can do that in one of my show notes.
See, there you go. Okay, I have a question too before we go. For my podcast, the How to Podcast series, which we're doing right now, is there anything that a content, a topic, something that you're like, I wish somebody would talk about A, B, or C, because that'll help me to kind of develop some more episodes coming up in the future. Is there anything from your point of view where you're like, I can't find anybody who's talking about Fill in the blank. Because that'll help me. Selfishly, I'm asking.
I know, but I haven't thought about it.
There's a lot of podcasts out there to help for podcasters, which is great.
Yes. And there's a lot of podcasts. I mean, okay, people, don't let the number of podcasts that are started every day stop you.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Just want to say that. I think you talked about one of the most important things, which is how to hold space. I think that's a really important piece, and also how to not get completely overwhelmed by the learning curve. Okay. So I have two very similar, completely trite expressions that I use. One I use with my son, who gets really, really anxious about big piles of work, which is, how do you eat an elephant?
Right.
One bite at a time. Right? And the opposite, which I use with my partner in this nonprofit, is, you can't boil the ocean.
Oh.
So pick something that you can control and do that well. And don't try to do it all at one time, or everything everywhere all at once, which I haven't seen, but it's an amazing title.
I love it. Thank you so much for being part of this podcast. Thank you. I'm going to hold the space. I would love to have you back in the future as topics arise and you're like, I need to come on and just chat with Dave. I've learned something new, or I'm trying something on my podcast and I'd like to talk to Dave about it and share with his audience some of the things I'm learning as a podcaster. I'm holding a space, and I'd love to have you come back in the future if that serves you and helps promote your show as well. So please consider that as a welcome mat that's there for you anytime, please. And I just thank you so much for being part of the show. And I'm looking forward to getting some response from the women that are listening to this podcast that are like, finally, someone has allowed all the noise to stop, and I have a chance to speak. You demonstrated it here in the podcast, so that was you, and I appreciate that so much.
Well, thank you for having me on, and I will definitely come back. I have ideas for different podcasts I want to start, and I want to talk them over with you and find out if they're good ideas. But thanks for having me on. It's been a real pleasure.
So everyone, please go to the show notes. Make sure you go check out the podcast. Go like, subscribe, follow, share, and let's help promote each other, and let's rise that tide and help all the ships to rise together. And that's something we can all do. So thank you everyone for listening, and thank you for being. Then don't boil the ocean. Don't do that either. I love it. Awesome. Thank you so much. We're going to talk again soon.
Thank you so much, Dave.